Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 159 and it's titled Mono Blue Dream Conductor. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Sven von Nimwegen on YouTube. And as a quick side note, if you want any of your cards suggested to be picked for this video in the future, just make sure you put comments into this video or find us anywhere on social media and I'm happy to get to all of them. But if you want to guarantee that your video shows up, then make sure to check us out on Patreon or as a channel member. So with all of that being said, a quick look at the card suggested by Sven, which was Dream Halls. And Dream Halls is 3 blue for an enchantment. Instead of paying the casting cost for a spell of any color, its caster may choose and discard a card that shares at least one color with that spell, and if the spell has X in its casting cost, X is 0. So what this essentially does is allows each player to discard a card that shares a color with another spell to cast that spell for free. Now, obviously, this is going to be most beneficial in a mono blue deck, so obviously when I started looking at our commanders, I wanted to pick a mono blue commander, but there weren't any that really struck my eye for what I wanted the deck to do until I found Toluz. And Toluz Clever Conductor, you may notice, is technically an Esper commander. She's a white-blue, a blue, and a blue-black for a 3-mana creature, but because she's a white-blue, a blue, and a blue-black, we can actually cast her with only blue mana, and that is exactly what we're doing because we are not playing a single white or black spell in this entire deck. We are focusing on being a mono blue deck with Toluz in the command zone because there's no real downside to it. And so the reason we wanted Toluz is because, of course, she's a 3-mana, 3/1 human rogue, but her ability says whenever Toluz enters the battlefield, it connives, so we draw a card, then discard a card, and if we discard a non-land, we put a +1/+1 counter on her. And whenever you discard one or more cards, exile them from your graveyard, and when Toluz dies, put the cards exiled with it into their owner's hand. So since we intend to be discarding a ton of cards to Dream Halls, this is a great way to then get extra value out of those cards, because once Toluz dies, we get to take every card that we discarded and put it back into our hand. Now, obviously, that's not the only thing that we're going to be doing because we got to figure out a bunch of other things with the deck. So, with that being said, let's jump into some of our themes for this week and pick apart why this deck works the way that it does. Obviously, the first theme for this deck is going to be discarding. We have a ton of ways to benefit from discarding and to also force ourselves to discard some cards, and a great example of that is All-Seeing Arbiter, which is 4 blue for a 5/4 avatar. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. And whenever we discard a card, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-0 until your next turn, where X is the number of different mana values among cards in your graveyard. Now, the kind of obvious one out of the way here, we're not going to have a ton of cards in our graveyard because of the way that Toluz works with discarding, but we will still be casting some spells. We'll maybe have some of our stuff removed. So this isn't going to be a huge number. X might be 2, maybe 3 if we're lucky, but even giving a creature -2 or -3 until our next turn is enough to prevent it from doing a ton of damage. And if we can trigger this multiple times, which in our deck is not very difficult, this can really shut down a lot of combat-focused synergies and protect us in ways that you might not expect it to at front value. So All-Seeing Arbiter is a great example of why discard is important for this deck, but of course it's not the only theme in the deck, as our next theme revolves around counterspells. One of the biggest ways we can lose the game is if someone counters Toluz pretty consistently, or even worse, counters Dream Halls. We need to make sure that some of our pieces can stick and hit the board, so we do want to focus on countering what our opponents are doing, And alongside that, we also tried to play counterspells that have either very low costs, 1 or 2 mana counterspells, but also spells that did other things. So for example, we have Neutralize, which is 1 blue for an instant, counter target spell, but it also has Cycling for 2. So this is a card that we could cycle with Toluz on the board, which would then be discarded, and we can then put it under Toluz. So not every card in our deck has to be discarded in some way, but I tried to lean into discarding cards because that gives us a little extra value. So if we don't need the counterspell, we can throw it away and get something else. But most of the counterspells are going to be in this deck to protect Toluz and to protect our Dream Halls. So those are our first 2 themes, and our last theme is going to look a little bit strange considering we are technically mono blue, and that is going to be sacrifice synergies. One of the biggest ways, other than of course just countering Toluz, that we can get blown out with this deck is if Toluz hits the board and we exile, say, 10, 15 cards with her ability, and then someone exiles her, because Toluz specifically says that she needs to die for us to put those cards into our hand. We need to make sure that we always have a way to sacrifice Toluz. That way, if someone does try to exile her or bounce her, we have a way to still get those cards back, and they're not exiled forever. One of the best ways we can do that is with Abjure. And Abjure is 1 blue mana for an interrupt, now it is an instant, sacrifice a blue permanent, which is Toluz, counter target spell. So this plays double duty in this deck because it is a 1 mana counter spell, which is very powerful, and it allows us to sacrifice Toluz whenever we need to, meaning that all we've got to do is cast a spell, and we can even counter our own spell if we need to, just to sacrifice Toluz. And there are a ton of other sacrifice synergies in here as well. This is not the only one. And if you're interested in seeing what Abjure can really do in a mono blue aristocrat style deck, we did do a Geralf deck a little while back that was built around that, so do go check that out. I'll make sure it is linked on screen for you if you're interested. But that is what our deck is trying to do. Those are our themes for this week. And of course, the next thing we got to do for our deck tech is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that are the MVPs of the deck. They're incredibly important to the strategy, their value engines, and in some cases, win conditions. So, starting off with our first key card, we gotta talk about Enter the Infinite. This is the card that we really want to have in our hand when we resolve Dream Halls, because it is a massive 8 and 4 blue for 12 total mana for a sorcery that says draw cards equal to the number of cards in your library, then put a card from your hand on top of your library. You have no maximum hand size until your next turn. If we have Dream Halls, we can discard a blue spell to cast Enter the Infinite for free, and at that point we have our entire deck in our hands and a way to cast every spell in our hand for free, meaning at that point there's really no reason we should lose the game, because as soon as we try to win, we have plenty of counterspell backup, we have plenty of interaction in our hand, we've got more card draw, we've got everything we could possibly need once we resolve and Enter the Infinite. If in this deck we resolve and Enter the Infinite, it's pretty much over. There's not anything our opponents can really do to stop us, so that is why it's definitely one of our key cards. Next up, though, we have Mask of the Schemer, and this is one of the best forms of repeatable conniving in the deck, which is a great way to both draw and discard cards, because it is 2 and a blue for an artifact equipment. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, it connives X, where X is the amount of damage it dealt to that player, then it equips for 2. Putting this onto Toluz is a great way to get a ton of value throughout the course of the game, because even if Toluz comes down and we discard a non-land to her connive ability, so she's a 3/1, if she gets in at a single opponent while equipped with Mask of the Schemer, she then connives 3 times, so we draw 3 cards, discard 3 cards, exile all 3 of those cards with Toluz, and if they're all non-lands, put 3 +1/+1 counters on her, meaning that it only really takes a couple of turns for her to become a massive and lethal commander threat with Mask of the Schemer. Plus, we really start churning through our deck, and we have ways to make her unblockable and indestructible and all those different things to make sure that she sticks on the board. So Mask of the Schemer Really does everything we want it to be doing and is an all-star in this deck. But finally, we get to our last key card, which is one of the most important ways for us to win the game, and that is going to be Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. And I know this is the second week in a row we've talked about something like Jace or Laboratory Maniac, but trust me, it's very important for what we're trying to do. So Jace is 1 blue, blue, blue for a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Jace. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. Then, +1, target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card, and -8, draw 7 cards. Then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. Obviously, this is an automatic win with Enter the Infinite, which is why if we resolve an Enter the Infinite with Dream Halls in play, there's really not a way for us to lose the game, because then we can drop Jace, mill the final card in our library, draw a card, and immediately win the game with Counterspell backup. So Jace essentially acts as a combo piece once we've resolved Dream Halls, because we can churn through most of our deck. A lot of our cards draw other cards, a lot of our cards discard cards. We can sacrifice Toluz to draw more cards and put the cards that she exiled into our hand. And then once we drop Jace, the game is literally just over. So it is definitely the most useful of these spells that say if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game, but it is not the only one. We have a couple others as well, but Jace just really plays well with this deck. So I wanted to highlight how good that card is with everything else that we're trying to do. That, though, brings us to the end of our key cards, so the next thing we got to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. These are some cards that synergize incredibly well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are just kind of fun cards that I like to show off. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between Arcanist's Owl and Steel of the Godhead. And I know you might be looking at these cards and thinking, but Zach, these are not mono blue cards. They are technically Azorius cards. And while that is true, we are lucky enough that because our commander's color identity is Esper, we are actually allowed to play blue and black spells. We are choosing not to, but because both of these cards can be cast for only blue mana, we are still including them because they're still technically mono blue cards in this deck. So I did want to clear that up before we actually talk about how these two interact with each other, because Arcanist Owl is 4 mana, either blue or white. In this deck, it's going to be blue. For an artifact creature bird, it's a 3/3 with flying. When Arcanist Owl enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact or enchantment card from among them, put it into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Normally, Arcanist Owl is going to be here to try to find Dream Halls, but once we have the Dream Halls played, it's just a great way to dig for other things, like, for example, Steel of the Godhead, which is 2 and a white or a blue. For an enchantment aura, enchant creature. As long as enchanted creature is white, it gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. And as long as enchanted creature is blue, it gets +1/+1 and is unblockable. With that, we can put it on any creature and make it unblockable, but if there's a creature that is also white, like for example Arcanist's Owl, it gets both of those abilities. So with Arcanist Owl enchanted by Steel of the Godhead, it becomes a 5/5 flying lifelink unblockable, which is significantly better than just a 3/3 flyer. It's also worth noting that because Toluz is an Esper colored commander, she's white, blue, and black, she also counts as being white and blue, so Steel of the Godhead will also give her +2/+2 lifelink and unblockable, which is pretty impressive stats considering she starts as a 3/1. So Steel of the Godhead is very powerful in this deck. Arcanist Owl being able to dig for Steel of the Godhead, also very important. But being able to just kind of enchant Arcanist Owl when we have nothing else going on is a great way to get a little bit of life back and pressure our opponents. So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 is going to be between Containment Construct and Ghostly Pilferer. Containment Construct is, once again, kind of an all-star in this deck. I know I've said that about a lot of cards, but there's just so much synergy in this deck. It's 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature construct. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you may play that card this turn. Now, the nice thing about this is that everything on it is a May ability, so we do not have to exile the card from our graveyard when we discard it, but we can, and if we do, we can play it. It is also worth noting that you have to stick to the actual casting times of a spell. So for example, if you discard a sorcery, you cannot cast it on an opponent's turn because it's still a sorcery. You would have to cast an instant that way, but it's still very good nonetheless. And it's even better when we combine it with Ghostly Pilferer, which is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Spirit Rogue. Whenever Ghostly Pilferer becomes untapped, you may pay 2. If you do, draw a card. And whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. Then you can also discard a card, and Ghostly Pilferer can't be blocked this turn. Being able to have a free discard outlet at any time is incredibly powerful when we can technically discard the card, make a creature unblockable, and then still cast that card that we discard because of Containment Construct. And I can't really talk up Ghostly Pilferer enough. If it's a card that you haven't tried in Commander, I highly recommend it because it draws cards whenever your opponents cast their commanders or when they cast something from exile or from their graveyard. And I don't think I've ever seen Ghostly Pilferer in a game where it wasn't a relevant part of the game. Just being able to draw cards and be unblockable and be a discard outlet is just incredibly powerful. So if given the chance, do test out Ghostly Pilferer. It's one of my pet cards that I have thrown in so many decks over the years, and I've never seen it underperform. So with that being said, I do think we'll move on from our cool interactions to the final part of our deck tech, where we are going to talk a little bit about budget. So as I mentioned earlier, we are trying to get this deck under a $100 budget, and this week we came in at $76.55, with the most expensive card in the deck being, surprise, surprise, Dream Halls, because it is $19.96. Now, you could cut Dream Halls from this deck, but considering the entire deck is built around it, I feel like that just vastly changes what the deck is trying to do. So, if you are looking for the second most expensive card to cut, that would be Nezahal Primal Tide. And Nezahal is 5 blue for a 7/7 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. Nezahal can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card, and discard 3 cards. Exile Nezahal and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So it has a ton of words on this card, but you may have noticed that every single line of text is incredibly powerful, which is why this is a $6.28 card. Now, if you did want to trim the price of the deck, you could cut Nezahal and drop it to about $70 instead of $76. However, I do highly recommend keeping Nezahal in the deck because not only is it a 7/7 that can't be countered, so it's a huge, massive attacker, gives us no maximum hand size, which is great for what we're trying to do when we're drawing a ton of cards, draws us even more cards when our opponents cast non-creature spells, so even if they try to kill Nezahal with something like a Swords to Plowshares, we draw a card off of it. It's also a free discard outlet because we can discard 3 cards, and it protects itself by exiling itself and returning it to play at the beginning of the next end step. So it really is the total package. If you've, kind of like I mentioned earlier with Ghostly Pilferer, if you've never played a deck that had Nezahal in it, it is a deck that can take over the game, a card that can really warp the entire game around it, because your opponents have to remove it, or you've created such a huge value engine that there's nothing they're going to be able to do to stop you. So Nezahal really is worth the price if you can squeeze it in. Of course, if you can't, there are a ton of other blue ways to draw cards, so that's not to say this is 100% necessary. I just think it's a worthy include if you can include it. On the other hand, though, if you're looking for a card to include in the deck that is a little out of the budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So if you don't mind a little increase to the price, you could also add in Ledger Shredder. And Ledger Shredder is 1 and a blue for a 1/3 Bird Advisor. It's got flying. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. The nice thing about Commander is that because there's 4 players, this is most likely going to be triggering at least once around the table, but honestly, it's probably going to be triggering more likely to be 2, 3, and sometimes even 4 times all the way around the table. The other thing that's also relevant is that it counts every player on every turn. So if, for example, the player to our left casts 2 spells on their turn, we connive, and then we pass to player 3, and that player casts 2 spells, but the other player that already went also casts another 2 spells, we will get to connive twice because it's seen both players cast multiple spells that turn. So technically, we could get this up to, 4 times on each player's turn, so it could theoretically trigger up to 16 times around the table. I highly doubt that's ever going to happen, but hey, you never know. There's always a possibility. So being able to do that just over and over and over means we are drawing a ton of cards, we're seeing a ton of cards, and we're discarding a bunch of cards which can be exiled to Toluz to then get us even more value when we eventually sacrifice her. Plus, it's making Ledger Shredder just a huge beater that can fly, and at that point, that's enough to close out some games right there. So obviously, if we are putting in Ledger Shredder, we would have to take a card out of the deck, and luckily we can take out a card that's the exact same mana value in Compulsion, which is also 1 in a blue for an enchantment, and that one allows you to pay 1 in a blue to discard a card from your hand and draw a card, and also 1 in a blue to sacrifice Compulsion and draw a card. Now, while Compulsion is not a bad card, and in this deck it does do quite a bit, it is unfortunately falling behind when you look at the power compared to Ledger Shredder. Having to pay 2 mana just to discard and draw a card, which is something Ledger Shredder can do for free, makes it just kind of a little less relevant, especially when you consider that we've also had to spend 2 mana to play it, meaning that for our first activation, just to discard 1 card and draw 1 card, it's costing us a total of 4 mana. That's really not where we want to be with the deck, and it's a great fallback plan, a great way to use unspent mana. So again, that's not to say it's bad, especially at 1 cent, so it is a very budget include, which is amazing. But compared to Ledger Shredder, it just doesn't quite cut it. So if you don't mind a little bit more in the budget, this is a swap I would recommend. If you don't want to spend that extra money, or you just don't feel like making the swap, it's okay. Compulsion still works very well in the deck. So with all of that being said, I think it's time we move on from the actual deck tech and start to take a look at how the deck performs in a game. Before that, however, I do want to take a second to highlight some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. Like I mentioned earlier, I am happy to take any suggestions people have for future videos, but if you want to guarantee that your suggestion is turned into a video, please do check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member, and that is one of the amazing perks that you get. Otherwise, I do want to shout out all of our patrons and channel members, so a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much, and if you would like to join that group of people as well, like I said, check us out on Patreon or as a channel member. But with all of that being said, let's see how this deck performs in a game. So this week, we are going to be joined by 3 separate opponents, and this time it is going to be Bilal playing Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter, Luke playing Yargle and Multani, and Doodle playing Wart, the Raid Mother. So starting off with Bilal's Rashmi deck, this is kind of a ramp / extra turn style deck. He really just wants to kind of take as many extra turns as possible and ramp out as many big value threats as possible and draw a ton of cards. It is kind of like the quintessential Simic deck, and it's very Bilal's style when it comes to what the game wants to look like. He definitely wants to control the game and make sure that he's the one that is managing what's going on the board, and then eventually just taking people out with huge threats. So definitely, I think the deck that I am the most concerned about going into this, just because it's the only other deck at the table with blue, so they're probably the only ones that can interact with some of our spells on the stack, so that is something to be aware of. Next up, we have Luke and his Yargle and Multani deck, which is just a massive 18/6 vanilla creature. So he really wants to turn Yargle and Multani into a bit of a Voltron strategy, wants to just smack people with the giant frog. And if I'm being perfectly honest, that is so perfect, and it's just an absolute blessing of a deck in all sense of the word, because it is everything that I want to see out of a deck, everything I want to play against out of a deck. This is just a perfect combination of smashing face, drawing cards, and just really weird shenanigans that I am all about. So I am very excited for Yargle and Multani, and I cannot wait to see how it does. And then finally, moving into Doodle and his Wart the Raid Mother deck. This is kind of similar to Bilal's Rashmi deck, kind of a Spellslinger deck. He wants to play a bunch of big instants and sorceries, but he specifically wants to be copying them to do a ton of damage to his opponents. He wants to be stealing his opponent's creatures, he wants to be making a ton of mana, he wants to be burning out the table, and he wants to find ways to use those red and green instants and sorceries to just generate a ton of value and then copy them to make even more value. And I'm really not 100% sure what to expect out of the Wart deck, if I'm being honest. I haven't played against a ton of Wart in the past, so I'm very excited to see what it does, and I know Doodle is very good at building decks, so I'm sure he's got some great surprises in store for us. But those are our opponents for this week. Let me know down in the comments what your predictions are for the game. Let me know who you think is going to win. Maybe let me know who you think is going to have the best play of the game. But I think it's time that we actually jump into this game, see how we do, and hopefully come out the winner. So, with all of that being said, we're going to jump in. Hope you all enjoy it. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Luke, myself, and then Doodle. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a forest and casts Birds of Paradise. Luke plays an tapped Overgrown Tomb. I play an island. Doodle plays a Temple of Abandon, scrying 1. Bilal plays a forest and casts Renati Behemoth Caller, letting his creatures enter with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to their mana value -4. Luke plays a Tainted Wood. I play an island and cast Ghostly Pilferer, drawing a card when an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, letting me pay 2 when it untaps to draw a card, and also letting me discard a card to make it unblockable until the end of turn. Doodle plays a Thriving Grove, naming red, so it taps for both of his colors, then casts Llanowar Elves. Bilal casts Plea for Power, having the table vote to either give him an extra turn or draw 3 cards, and we vote to let him draw 3 cards. Then he plays an island, and on Luke's turn he plays a forest, and casts Scepter of Celebration. On my turn, I play an island, then cast my commander Toluz Clever Conductor, conniving 1 when she enters, drawing a card, discarding a compulsion, and putting a +1/+1 counter on her. Then, whenever I discard a card, it's exiled from my graveyard, and when she dies, all cards exiled with her go back to my hand. I then move to combat and attack Bilal for 2 with my Ghostly Pilferer. Doodle plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, then casts Goblin Warchief, making his goblins cost 1 less to cast and giving them all haste, letting him attack Bilal for 2. Bilal plays an island and casts his commander Rashmi Eternity's Crafter, so now whenever he casts his first spell each turn, he reveals the top card of his library, casting it for free if its mana value is less than the spell he cast, then putting the revealed card into his hand if he doesn't cast it. This also lets me draw a card with Ghostly Pilferer. Luke plays a swamp, and when I untap for my turn, I pay 2 mana to draw a card with the Pilferer, play an island, and attack Doodle for 4 with Toluz and Luke for 2 with Ghostly Pilferer. In my second main phase, I cast Sig River Cutthroat, drawing a card in each end step if an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn, and since Doodle lost 4, I get to draw a card when I move to my end step this turn. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Gruul Guildgate. Bilal plays a forest and casts Karn's Temporal Sundering, taking an extra turn and returning Doodle's Llanowar Elf to his hand. In response, Luke casts Putrefy, destroying Renati. Then the Sundering resolves, and Bilal reveals the top card of his library for Rashmi's ability, revealing a forest and putting it into his hand. Before Bilal ends his turn though, Doodle casts Expedite on Goblin Warchief to give it haste and draw a card. Then Bilal passes to himself for his extra turn, and in his extra turn he plays a forest, then attacks Luke for 2 and passes. Luke plays a swamp. I play a Scavenger Grounds and cast Mask of Avacyn, equipping it to Toluz, giving her +1/+2 and hexproof. I then move to combat and attack Bilal for 2. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Goblin Anarchomancer, making all his green or red spells cost 1 less to cast, then recasts Llanowar Elves and attacks Bilal for 2. At the end of turn, Bilal casts Archmage's Charm to draw 2 cards and reveals Zendikar Resurgent with Rashmi's trigger, putting it into his hand. Then on Bilal's turn, he cast Wormcoil Engine, revealing an island with Rashmi, putting it into his hand and then playing it for turn. Luke plays a Llanowar Wastes and casts his commander, Yargul and Multani, letting me draw a card, but unfortunately Bilal has a response, countering it with Mana Drain, letting him make 6 colorless mana in his next main phase since the spell it countered had a mana value of 6. This also has him revealing Omniscience with Rashmi's trigger, putting it into his hand. On my turn I play a High Market and attack Luke for 3, so at the end of turn I draw a card with Sig, and discard to hand size, exiling a Lonely Sandbar with Toluz. Doodle plays a mountain and casts his commander, Wart the Raid Mother, making 2 1/1 goblin tokens, giving his red and green instant or sorcery spells Conspire, and letting me draw a card. He then casts Traitorous Greed, tapping his goblin tokens to Conspire it, copying the spell so he gains control of Wormcoil Engine and Rashmi, untapping them, giving them haste, and making 4 additional mana. He then casts Uncaged Fury, tapping the Anarchomancer and the Warchief to Conspire it, copying it to give both Wart and Wormcoil Engine +1/+1 and double strike. This lets him attack Bilal for 24 while Doodle gains 14 life, then at the end of turn, I draw for Sig. In Bilal's first main phase, when the delayed trigger for Mana Drain goes on the stack, I cycle Nimble Obstructionist to counter it, preventing Bilal from making 6 colorless mana and exiling the Obstructionist with Toluz. Then Bilal attacks Doodle for 6 with Wormcoil Engine, gaining 6 life, and in his second main phase, he casts Zendikar Resurgent, letting him draw a card whenever he casts a creature spell, and letting his lands tap for 2 mana. This also triggers Rashmi, revealing a Hydroid Crisis, putting it into his hand, and at the end of turn I draw for Sig. Luke casts Timeless Witness, returning Yargul and Multani from his graveyard to his hand, and at the end of turn I cycle a Desert of the Mindful, exiling it with Toluz. On my turn, I play an island and cast Noble Benefactor, letting each player search their library for a card and put it into their hand whenever it dies. I move to combat, attacking Doodle for 5 with Toluz, letting me draw a card at the end of turn with Sig, and I also have to discard to hand size, exiling 2 islands and Midnight Clock with Toluz. On Doodle's turn, he attacks Bilal for 8 with all of his creatures except the goblin tokens, and Bilal blocks 3 of it with Rashmi, killing his commander and only taking 5. Then in the second main phase, Doodle casts Chandra's Ignition, tapping his 2 goblin tokens to Conspire it, copying it, targeting Wart twice to do 3 damage to each creature and player twice, hitting everything for 6 total damage. In response, Bilal casts Counterspell to counter the original Ignition, meaning everything only takes 3 damage instead. This does still kill most creatures in play, letting each player search their library for a card, putting it into their hand, and also letting me put each card exiled with Toluz into my hand. Notably, Toluz had 4 toughness here, so she wouldn't have died, but I did intend to sacrifice her before my turn with the High Market, so it doesn't change too much. After that resolves, Doodle casts Return to Nature, destroying Zendikar Resurgent, but in response, Bilal exiles Hydroid Crisis from his hand to cast Force of Will for free, countering the removal spell. Still in response, I cast Negate, countering Bilal's Force of Will, letting the Return to Nature resolve and destroy Zendikar Resurgent. On Bilal's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking Doodle for 6 with Wormcoil Engine and gaining 6 life. Luke plays a Swamp and recasts his commander Yargle Multani, but unfortunately Bilal has a response, casting Torrential Gearhulk, letting him cast an instant from his graveyard without paying its mana cost, exiling it, letting him once again cast Mana Drain to counter Yargle Multani and get 6 colorless mana in his next main phase. At the end of turn, I cycle Desert of the Mindful. On my turn, I play an island and cast Dream Halls, letting each player cast spells for free by discarding a card from their hand that shares a color with it. Once that resolves, I cast my commander Toluz, still paying 2 mana for her commander tax, by discarding Midnight Clock, then conniving when she enters, drawing a card, discarding a key to the city, exiling it with Toluz, and putting a +1/+1 counter on her. After that, I cast Enter the Infinite by discarding Compulsion, exiling it with Toluz, drawing all the cards in my library and putting 1 card back on top. In response, Bilal discards Jin-Gitaxias to cast Fierce Guardianship, countering Enter the Infinite. Still in response, I discard Steel of the Godhead to cast Abjure, sacrificing Toluz as an additional cost and putting all her exiled spells back into my hand, then Enter the Infinite resolves. After that, I discard Steel of the Godhead again to cast Laboratory Maniac, letting me win the game if I would draw a card while there's no cards in my library. As a little extra insurance, I also cast Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, also letting me win the game if I would draw a card while there's no cards left in my library. Then by activating Jace's +1 ability, I'm able to mill myself for 2 and draw a card from my empty library, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I'm not gonna lie, there was a lot going on in that game, and unfortunately for Luke and his Yargle Multani deck, he didn't get to do quite as much as he wanted. He really flooded incredibly hard, couldn't land Multani, got it countered multiple times, and unfortunately really didn't get to do much. So hopefully we get to see the Yargle and Multani deck again in the future, because I know it's got some amazing cards in there, and I know it could be super sweet. We just didn't quite get to see it this time. Moving counterclockwise around the table, going to Bilal, his deck really did what it wanted to do. He was able to take at least 1 extra turn, almost took a second one, and if we're being honest, probably should have taken a second one. That early in the game, probably an extra turn versus 3 cards would have been better, but I was one of the people championing, I think is how you say it. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I was the one fighting for him to draw the 3 cards. So let me know down in the comments if the turn that Bilal cast the voting spell to either draw 3 cards or to take an extra turn, let me know what you think was the right call, because we were very divided on it as a table. And I was one of the big ones pushing for draw 3. Doodle was really pushing for the extra turn. So let me know what you think, because I would be super interested to hear people's arguments either way for that one. But other than that, it was kind of impressive that Bilal had so much interaction and we were still able to kind of squeeze out a victory. I think we got incredibly lucky that he spent most of his interaction on Yargle and Multani or dealing with what Doodle had going on. So it was very impressive that he wasn't able to kind of scrounge up a win. I think that there were a couple of things that needed to go right in his favor, and I think we really stuck a wrench in his plans, which I'm usually the person to stop Bilal from winning, so I'm sure that comes as no surprise to him that somehow him losing was my fault. But definitely a great showing by the Rashmi deck. And then, of course, going around to Doodle, talking about his Wart deck. Also very cool. I think the idea of copying the theft spells and the double strike spells and then Chandra's Ignition was very, very cool. And I think that being able to just play off of your opponent's power level by taking their things and then having them take the damage from those things was very, very cool, especially because the Traitorous Greed that he used to steal creatures also produced 2 mana, so by copying it, he actually got to cast the spell for free, which is super sweet. So definitely some neat interactions and some very cool synergies in there. And also another deck that I would not mind seeing again in the future. It seemed like a lot of fun to play, and honestly, it made for a good board state as well. And then, of course, finally, we got to talk about our own deck. And that time, really our deck felt unbeatable, if I'm being perfectly honest. There weren't a lot of times throughout the course of the game where I felt like we were in danger. I had counter spells in my hand for most of the game. Being able to draw into the Enter the Infinite and then tutor up the Dream Halls with the Noble Benefactor really set us up for a great combo win turn at the end. But being able to have constant access to card draw and counter spells, and being able to sacrifice Toluz to get more counter spells and more card draw and more just generic value. I don't say this about a lot of our decks often, but it really felt like it was tough for us to lose the game. And obviously, I don't know what was going on in our opponent's hands during that game, but watching everything go down and just kind of knowing that, hey, I've got the win in my hand, I've got counterspell backup, I've got extra interaction if I need it, I felt like once that Dream Hall's resolved, we weren't going to lose. So if you do decide to put this deck together, I think the biggest suggestion I can give is to make sure that you protect that Dream Halls, because I think that our deck starts to crumble without it. I don't think we really get the actual power we need to finish a game without it, but I also think that it can allow your opponents to kind of interact in ways you may not expect, because you may have saw at the end of the game Bilal cast a Fierce Guardianship despite the fact that he didn't have his commander in play, because he was also able to use the Dream Halls. So that is something to be very aware of when you play this deck, but like I said, it felt very strong and it was a ton of fun to play. So I hope you all liked the deck tech. I hope you all liked the video. I certainly did. This has been one of my most fun decks that I've put together in a while. I really had a blast playing it. So Sven, thank you so much for the suggestion. Hope you enjoyed it as well as the person who suggested it. But let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you think should go into this deck or maybe should come out. Maybe I put something in here that you're like, that doesn't quite fit. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos. And as always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. I really do appreciate it, and I love reading everybody's comments. So if you've got anything to say, I will always hear it, and I will always do my best to respond to it. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all for enjoying. Hopefully you did enjoy. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.